In Warwickshire, some castles still dominate the landscape. Others have almost vanished. Fillongley belongs to that second group. At first glance, there is very little to see here. A few earthworks, a fragment of masonry, a hollow in the ground, a stream slipping quietly through pasture. But these traces belong to not one castle, but two. And together they tell a story of conquest, lordship, and a medieval landscape that still survives beneath the fields. This is Fillongley, in the old Forest of Arden of North Warwickshire. The village sits in a hollow, with ground rising around it, especially to the south and east. Historically, the western side of the parish was thickly wooded, while the eastern land was better suited to agriculture, crossed by lanes and watered by small streams. The modern village centre, which until the 19th century was known as New Fillongley, likely developed around the building of the medieval castle and the parish church, but the earlier settlement lay elsewhere. What was known as Old Fillongley stood in the area now called Chapel Green, hinting that the focus of the community shifted over time as lordship and settlement patterns changed. It's exactly the kind of landscape where small castles made sense, not vast frontier fortresses, but local centres of control, status and management. And in Fillongley, the ground still preserves the memory of two such centres. The earlier site, now known as Castle Hills, and the later, more complex enclosure called Castle Yard. To understand why Fillongley ended up with two castles, we have to begin with the Norman Conquest and the great redistribution of land that followed. In the Domesday Book in 1086, Fillongley was not recorded as one simple manor. It was split into 4 portions of half a hide each. One half hide was held by Robert Despenser, one was held by Alsi, a man who had already held it in the time of King Edward before the conquest, a third belonged to the Bishop of Coutances, and was held under him by Lewin, and the fourth belonged to the Abbey of Coventry. Woodland was a major part of the value of this place, which fits the wider Arden setting of woods, clearings, pasture, and scattered settlements. So Fillongley began the Norman period as a divided place. Now this is significant, because castles were not only military structures, they were instruments for taking hold of land, enforcing lordship, overseeing its tenants, and making a new social order clearly visible. The first castle site lies to the north-east of the village, near Berryfields, and is now known as Castle Hills. Today it survives as earthworks, the remains of a motte-and-bailey castle. Historic England describes an oval motte, up to about 4 metres high, with a defensive ditch and a bailey to the southwest. Nearby, ridge and furrow earthworks show how later farming settled around and respected the old defences. Now this is the earliest Fillongley castle, a practical, early medieval work of earth and timber. It was not designed to impress the way a great later stone castle might. It was designed to be raised quickly, to dominate its immediate surroundings, and to make new authority physically present. The documentary record suggests that this first castle did not last long in active use. By the reign of Henry III, the site was already known as Old Fillongley, which strongly suggests that it had already been superseded. That short life is part of what makes Castle Hills so interesting. It's not a place of long architectural accumulation. It is a place that preserves an early phase of control, brief, functional, and then left behind. Now the site is set within private farmland, and it remains inaccessible to the public, aside from views afforded by a nearby footpath through an adjoining field. One of the most revealing things at Fillongley is that the castles are tied so closely to agriculture and water. Around Castle Hills, the ridge and furrow survives beside the monument. Now this has real importance as it shows the castle not as an isolated military outpost, but as part of a worked landscape. Fields, strips, tenants, boundaries, streams, roads, these were the real fabric of lordship. The same is true more broadly across the parish. Fillongley's position in the Arden meant that a long history of woodland clearance, settlement growth and agricultural use. Place names such as Wood End and Green End speak to that process of clearing and cultivation. The castle sat inside that changing world and drew their meaning from it. By the 13th century, Fillongley was firmly associated with the Hastings family. The first known and confirmed tenant of the manor, named in Victoria County history, is Henry de Hastings in 1235-36. Fillongley became the family's chief residence in Warwickshire before their later expansion through marriage and inheritance. This is the point where Fillongley stops being simply a doomsday place name and becomes part of a wider aristocratic story. The Hastings family would eventually connect themselves to Abergavenny and later to the earldom of Pembroke. But Fillongley seems to have been one of the places where that rise was certainly rooted. At some point, the centre of lordship shifted south to the site now known as Castle Yard. This is the stronger visual survivor in Fillongley today, and a more complex monument. Historic England describes it as a ringwork castle with an associated bailey, covering about 2 hectares and carefully fitted into a landscape defined by 3 stream channels. The streams appear to have been diverted as part of the construction, helping to form the defences and feed the ditches. The ringwork itself lies in the western part of the site, enclosed by a ditch about 12 metres wide. Beyond parts of that ditch, there is an external rampart. Inside, the surface is uneven, suggesting buried remains, and crucially, masonry still survives. A substantial block of local sandstone representing part of a rectangular building, with the remains of a circular stair recorded beside it. Other fragments of stonework, traces of paving, and a well have also been noted. This is why Castle Yard feels different from Castle Hills. Castle Hills is almost entirely earthwork, whereas Castle Yard still carries the residue of architecture. Not enough to reconstruct the full plan with confidence, but enough to show that this was a more permanent and more elaborate residence. It may be best understood not as a giant war castle, but as a defended manor centre, a place where status, residence, administration and security all met. In 1301, Sir John de Hastings was granted licence to crenellate his manor and town of Fillongley. At the same time, he received a weekly market on Mondays and an annual fair running from the 23rd to the 27th of June. That moment is revealing. A licence to crenellate was partly practical, but it was also political theatre. It was a royal acknowledgement of status, and paired with a market and fair, it shows Fillongley not simply as a residence in the countryside, but as a local centre of exchange and authority. Whether Castle Yard ever became a battlemented showpiece is harder to prove from the surviving remains, but the grant itself tells us that at the start of the 14th century, Fillongley was a place of real seigneurial ambition. The Hastings story soon widened beyond Warwickshire. John de Hastings died in 1313. His heirs led into the line of Lawrence de Hastings, the Earl of Pembroke, and from there into a complicated sequence of inheritance, mortgages, dowers, and noble connections. Fillongley passed through the orbit of Juliana de Leybourne and William de Clinton, but it later returned to the Hastings line, and after the death of the last young John de Hastings, around 1389 or 1390, its descent became tied up with Reynold de Grey of Ruthyn and the Abergavenny connection. In later generations the manor descended with the barony of Abergavenny, and associated houses included the Beauchamps and the Nevilles. That broader noble story helps explain something important on the ground. Once the family's centre of gravity moved elsewhere, Fillongley no longer needed to develop into a major castle in the mould of a great marcher or royal seat. It remained significant, but certainly wasn't central. Castle Yard is thought to have been abandoned by the late 14th or early 15th century. After that, the site slowly dissolved back into the manorial landscape. Stone was reused, earthworks were softened, watercourses shifted, and agriculture resumed its long dominance. But the manor did not disappear when the castle faded. The descent of Fillongley continued through later noble ownership, and by the early modern period, families such as the Holbecks appear in the record as bailiffs and landholders. The history of Fillongley after the medieval castle is not a story of emptiness. It's a story of continuity in new forms: a hall, farm, parish, tenancy, field and road. That is why places like Fillongley matter. They remind us that the end of the castle is rarely the end of a landscape. So why were there two castles at Fillongley? Now, the best answer is perhaps because the first was sufficient for the first generation of control, but not for the later needs of residence, display and estate management. Castle Hills belongs to the quick early world of Norman earth and timber power, whereas Castle Yard belongs to a later world, still defended but more settled, more architectural and more closely tied to the manor, the village and all the rhythms of lordship. That is not just a change in buildings, it's a change in medieval society itself within those few hundred years. Today neither castle survives in the way most people imagine a castle should, but Fillongley still preserves something rarer: the transition from one kind of castle to another, and the ability to read that transition in the land itself. Here in Warwickshire, the hidden castles are not always the ones with the tallest walls. Sometimes they're the ones the fields never quite manage to erase.